If you want your home cinema to feel like a real cinema, you need to hear Mag Theatron. With more than 20 years' experience in commercial theatres worldwide, Mag's award-winning speaker systems deliver the same cinematic impact, now purpose-built for residential use. Made in Ukraine and engineered in-house, up to 95% of every transducer is Mag's own design. From high SPL loudspeakers to infrasonic subwoofers and DSP-loaded amps, Mag Theatron is the real deal. Exclusively available in Australia through Integrate Unlimited. If you've ever wished for a design partner without the overhead, meet Colosseum. Launched in 2024, Colosseum is a white-label design and engineering service built specifically for integrators, whether you're new to the game or running million-dollar installs. They turn basic floor plans into detailed, high-impact cinema-ready documentation, brand agnostic, collaboration first, and led by industry veteran Paul McLean. I've seen the work myself. This is world-class support for serious cinema projects. Colosseum, your behind-the-scenes design team. Welcome to Master Integrator, the podcast where we explore what happens when technology, design, and people collide, and how to build smarter homes in the process. I'm your host, Paul Skelton. Before we begin, a quick thank you to our sponsors, Integrate Unlimited, the exclusive Australian distributor of Mag Theatron, and Colosseum, for making this episode possible. Today's guest is Richard Mullins from Chowmain Software, a technical lead who spent years solving problems created by someone else's shortcuts. In this conversation, we talk about technical debt, the small compromises and rushed decisions that build up quietly behind your walls and racks. We explore what it is, how it happens, and why ignoring it now only guarantees pain later. From poor documentation and fragile fixes to the stress of inheriting someone else's mess, Richard unpacks the root causes and offers some hard-earned advice on how to prevent it. If you want to build systems you're not afraid to revisit, this episode is for you. This is Master Integrator. Here's Richard Mullins. So let's start from the very beginning. Tell me a bit about the Richard story.
Okay. Well, I got into the industry quite a while ago. I've been an integrator or programmer now for, nearly 25 years, or over 25 years, actually. So obviously the industry's changed quite a lot. And I've changed my position and the way I approach the industry as well over that time. I started off from a sort of more computer maintenance type of background. I used to work for a large company doing that sort of work. I also had some time in retail, always on the sort of IT side of things. I did work as a professional programmer for a little while, but not at the same scale as I do now, but I had a little bit of that in my background as well. And I really got into integration mostly because I just found the whole concept kind of fascinating. It was a great extension of where I was in that IT space. I always enjoyed the concept of the industry and where things were going and so on. But the home automation side was just a chance to bring those things to life in a way that IT got a bit boring, I guess. And I've worked primarily in the residential side of things. That's been the vast majority of my my background for a few different companies, but I spent quite a long time with the same company, which I thought I was quite lucky to do. So I was also able to see jobs from the really, that run for 20 years and sort of see the genesis of changes and how things are affected and what the work we do really means to some of those people. Being in the residential industry is quite fascinating. You really get to work with people at a level that's perhaps a bit unusual in some of the other spaces. So that's been my background.
And you now work for Chowmain Software?
Yeah. So now I'm the CTO for Chowmain Software. We're a driver developer, so we write drivers for most of the major control system platforms. I work there doing some of the driver work, but also working internally on our technology path and running the teams there. And we're one of the biggest, well, we are the biggest driver manufacturer actually in the industry. So it's pretty exciting.
And what was the process like to transition from integrator to working for Chow Mein?
In a way, it was a fairly natural extension of what I'd been doing. The work we're doing now is the sort of thing I was doing before. The main difference is before I was really just doing it for one person or maybe a small group of people. Each job was quite different. So you'd sort of start, not exactly start again, but often you'd kind of start again. Whereas now I get to write software that gets used by many, many people. And that's a much more rewarding outcome, I feel. The work we're doing is I feel a bit more useful. Doing the bespoke stuff was fun, but after a while you get sick of sort of doing the same thing over and over again, starting from scratch. So now we get to run that everywhere. But in terms of the actual work I do, it's not dissimilar. I'm doing less hands-on physical install work, of course, but I used to primarily do programming in my previous jobs. So it's a fairly natural kind of extension for me.
And so one of the topics that we have spoken about a little bit in the past is this idea of technical debt. And it's something that you mentioned to me probably about 2 or so years ago now. So for the sake of this podcast and for the people listening to it, what is technical debt and why does it matter so much?
Look, this is a topic that's fairly close to my heart. The term actually comes from the software world, but broadly speaking, it just means something or some part of the process where you've probably made a decision for reasons of speed. Something needs to be delivered, and so you've made a choice that's not the optimal choice. You've perhaps taken a shortcut, but an intentional one, not necessarily a bad choice, just something that suits the purpose at the time. So the concept of technical debt is more about how you manage that as you go on. So in the immediate sense, making those compromises might be a rational choice. It might be the only choice. There's deadlines, things that we can't avoid. The idea of technical debt is identifying that you've made that and then scheduling work to fix those problems later, to deal with them later. So you're just not letting it languish. So in that way, I guess it's kind of like financial debt. You might take out a loan for a car to be more productive, get another guy on the road, for example. So it could be quite good for the business. But of course, if you don't pay the loan, that can be quite tragic as things go on. So this is a similar sort of idea, just with, it could be some cabling you've done or some documentation or any number of other things. But it's more about how you deal with it.
As you mentioned, it is a concept that is obviously from the software industry, but it seems to map very well to what integrators do as well. Was it a concept you were familiar with when you were an integrator? Obviously, you would have done it, but did you know the term technical debt, or was it something that you did kind of pick up when you went to Chow Mein and went, oh, okay, well, this is what that is?
Yeah, I think I was definitely more aware of it when I was doing software full time. I guess I'd inadvertently dealt with it without really realizing that's what it was. Certainly, there was elements of older jobs that I could identify later, thinking, yeah, well, that's a classic example. A job maybe that's a bit fragile, so you go back and you're a little scared to start working on it. It's a sure sign that you've probably done something that wasn't quite finished or not done exactly the right way when you were there the first time and hadn't gone back to deal with it. But on the software side, because that's something that we deal with fairly consistently, there's generally fairly specific deadlines that we've got to meet and so forth. And we also have the ability fairly easily to go back and manage those things down the track. It's a fairly common practice there where you're sort of saying, okay, well, this is where we can get to. Yeah, we'll continue work on this afterwards. We don't sort of, let those things go. We keep working on them. It doesn't really apply to drivers so much. So I guess in a direct sense, not really. This is more our back end, sort of our internal code. But certainly that's something that's much more conscious and front of mind for me. And it was only really when I reflected on my time as an integrator, it's like, wow, this really applies to the integration industry. And in fact, in a way, it applies even more because a lot of those things are sort of thrust upon you as an integrator. You don't necessarily always have a choice. I might have a release date that I'm trying to meet, but that's not the same as a builder saying, we're about to do the floors and you've got to leave. There's things that you can't avoid. So it's even more relevant, I think, in the custom integration side of things.
The word debt obviously carries negative connotations to a lot of people. So is technical debt always a bad thing? Or are there some cases where it's actually the right call or potentially legitimate?
Yeah, it's a good question. So it's not necessarily a negative thing. It can be if you don't deal with it, like real debt. It's certainly the concept is more about understanding that you've done something that's suboptimal, I suppose, or that needs to be addressed, and actually servicing that at a later stage. So if you think about it in more of a managerial perspective. It's more about managing the resources. We can't do this at the moment for reasons that may be out of your control, but either way, can't do something the right way, I suppose, or maybe we have the wrong part and we just have to put something in temporarily. As long as it gets handled later, as long as there's a conscious effort to fix that down the track, then it can be a positive thing. An example might be installing a temporary security system for a builder on a site that you're in. You might already have the security system that you're going to use for the rest of the job. If you can do it in a way that it's not going to get damaged and it's effectively ticking that box at the time, that's fine. You eventually pull it out, you refit it off later. If you left it there and just hope for the best, that would be terrible. But in most cases, you're going to do the right thing and fit it all off properly at the end. So that's an example of where you would just deal with it at the time, and it doesn't really become a debt in any meaningful sense because you've serviced that debt, you've fixed it, and moved on. So no, it doesn't need to be negative as long as you're dealing with it.
Can you think of any examples where you've seen maybe a bit more of a reckless attitude towards technical debt? Something that you sit there and go, that's just shouldn't have been done to start with, but it's only going to cause more problems as the project goes along?
Yeah, sure. Look, I mean, I guess we've all come across that, whether it's inadvertently or taking over from someone. There's a number of times where that happens, and it can be unintentional, of course, but certainly yes. Great examples might be where there's been some cabling changes at the last minute, which maybe have been done for all good reasons, but then they don't get reflected on a cable schedule, for example. So 6 months later, when someone's going out there to try and figure it out, that's just fallen by the wayside. Or someone's put in a low-rated power supply for something, and it's just not really the right tool for the job, and it might be fine, but maybe 2 years later it packs in. So if they're not dealt with, those things almost always come back to bite us.
So it definitely sounds like there's a few things there, though, that can be considered to not be deliberate or inadvertent in having to go down that path of using or accruing technical debt. Are there differences between deliberate and inadvertent technical debt? Like, is it possible to get yourself in a situation where you don't know that you're creating technical debt?
Yeah, oh, absolutely. So there's definitely, they actually, when they're describing the concept of technical debt at a sort of process level, they often split it up into sort of 4 categories, I guess, where, there's a sort of the inadvertent version of that that you might do with abandon. You don't even know you're doing the wrong thing. You're just blindly going in and hoping for the best. An example of that might just be like, we've got to get it done because we've run out of time. We're going to leave. And, you're not thinking about, for example, going back and saying, hey, this is not really ideal. We've got too tight a time frame. We need to change something down the track. If you're just hoping for the best, that's almost always going to work out badly. But there's also, that conscious sort of choice of going, look, I can't do it correctly today. They just asked me to make this last minute change, and there's no other way for me to do it, but I will schedule that in and come back and fix it down the track. And there's also a much more conscious version of those things too, where you are actively going, we can get this done if we make these compromises, and so we will deal with them later. But there's also a version of that where you might actively do something and then choose not to do it either, and that's where things tend to go quite wrong. So you can generally fix the ones, if you miss it and you're conscious of it and you reflect on it and go, well, we didn't do that great, we should deal with that. That's more of a learning experience. That happens to everyone. It's just part of the process. But making a conscious effort to do it, knowing that you're making a compromise and having no intention of fixing it is quite disastrous. And really, that's, I guess, part of thinking about this conceptually, making sure that it's part of the process, identifying it as it happens, so that you're not falling into that category, at all. That you just build it into your process, so you don't need to walk away and go, well, we can't do anything about it, because there's always a way to do something about it.
So how much of this is because of inexperience, or I guess compared to how much of it could you see being a deliberate act to have some form of end benefit to the integrator?
Yeah, I think a lot of it's partly inexperience, but also perhaps just not having fantastic internal processes. In a lot of cases, these things can just come down to some fairly simple things that we can all do. Documentation is a great example where it doesn't get updated, or it may be incorrect or not reflect the changes, I should say, that have been happening. It's a simple thing. We all know we should come back and fix all that sort of stuff, but sometimes you just get busy or distracted and it doesn't happen. But those types of things almost always come back to bite you down the track. That's a classic example of something that's reasonably common, but also reasonably easy to fix. So that's more of a process thing. It's not necessarily an experience as much as just not perhaps having good processes in place in the first place. The inexperienced part happens, but hopefully we all learn from those and improve as we go along and make sure they don't continually happen. But one thing that's also we lack, I feel, in general industry is we don't tend to check each other's work. We do things and, maybe it is an experienced guy having a go at it. You give them the plan, this is what you need to do. But we really need to be in there as well, checking afterwards and just making sure everything went okay, asking the questions, did everything go okay? Did you have to change anything? Is there anything we need to follow up? They're simple things, of course, and I'm sure everyone listening would feel like, yeah, I've done that. But nonetheless, there's a number of times where just those things slip through the cracks. So inexperience doesn't help, but really it's probably more about having a proper process to deal with it over the long term. That's the critical part.
As a project progresses, are there any warning signs that integrators should be looking for, or red flags that show that a project might actually have too much technical debt already accrued and it needs to be addressed? And I assume it's easier to address it earlier than later.
It might be, although, in some cases that's not always an option that you have. There could be a boat that's about to sail. You can't really do much about it until it gets back. So there's a number of things that in our industry that are, I guess, fairly unique to us. That means that it is that process is more important because you don't always get a choice of when you get to do those things. But certainly the signs are key to identify in the first place, definitely. If you can spot things going wrong, you may be able to address them as you go rather than having to wait. So an example might be if someone's been out on site and there was a last minute cabling change and you get out there the next time and you notice it hasn't actually been updated, just go and update the cable schedule then. It doesn't have to wait until the end or for the original person to do it. It's about fixing those things so that the next person that comes along doesn't get, in the same sort of situation that you're in. So definitely identifying them at any stage is very valuable. Whether or not you can fix them straight away, that'll sort of depend on the situation. But it at very least, it should be added to a job list or something, somewhere that we know, hey, this is something that went wrong that we need to deal with. Or it might only be something that went wrong. I don't want it to sound like a negative thing because it's really not actually a negative thing. It's just part of the space we're in. So it's not about people making mistakes. It's really just about identifying where things aren't, exactly where you need them to be and making sure that they don't get forgotten.
So you mentioned that it's not necessarily a bad thing. So what actually is the cost then, or the potential cost of a project accruing a lot of technical debt, but cost to integrators, maybe to the client, or even potentially future teams working on the project?
Yeah, well, look, I would say actually there's a significant financial cost most of the time. Because in reality, it means, 6 months later or somewhere down the track that something probably will go wrong. And if you're lucky, it might just be something that failed that you have to go back and replace that you should have done in the first place. But more often than not, it's a huge amount of time wasted trying to figure out where you're up to and why things aren't working. I mentioned that example before of having that job where everything's a bit fragile and you're too scared to touch anything. And so things that could be, in and out in an hour, all of a sudden are taking half a day because, you've got to double, triple check everything. You've got to check every device and make sure that you haven't caused something else to go wrong down the track. That's not necessarily a requirement if you're confident in how things have been put together in the first place. Generally, that's a sign that perhaps it wasn't really that great in the first place. Maybe the documentation is not quite accurate. You're making some assumptions about how some things work. And if you're in that boat and you're sitting there going, well, I don't really know, that's a great sign that you've sort of incurred that. And of course, then, yeah, like I said, instead of it taking an hour, it's all of a sudden taking half a day, or you have to make multiple visits because something's missing or needs to be replaced or repaired. So I'd say always, financial wise, always. How extreme that is will depend on what the problem is, of course. But yeah, no, I think if it's done correctly, even though it might feel like a more upfront cost, maybe a little bit more work as you go along, in the long run, it's going to save an extraordinary amount of time, and it's always worth it. There's never an argument not to do it, as far as I'm concerned.
So you mentioned documentation there and needing it to be up to date. So will that actually reduce the amount of technical debt, or is it more so it's easier to solve faults in the future?
It can certainly reduce it in the sense that a lot of the technical debt is probably from a lack of documentation in the first place. Particularly, in the custom install space, you've frequently being pushed and pulled around in what you're able to do by others. So it's often out of your control. You're not necessarily choosing to run a cable to a wall that's not going to exist in 2 weeks' time. They just rip it out and don't tell you. So there's often things that happen, at the last minute. Maybe they're going to do the floor all of a sudden. You've got to quickly patch something in. These things happen on every job, all of the time. And, as organisers, we all love to be, and we try and do our best to make sure that we're on top of everything, that we're working with a huge group of people typically. And so there's always going to be something that crops up that's a bit unexpected and often has an impact on what we're able to do. But if it's documented, and documentation may be literal documentation, we did it this way instead of that way, but it also might just be creating a service call sheet for some future time where it's like, hey, here's half a dozen things we need to address next time we're on site. If that's done effectively and in a sort of at the time, really, I guess, then that next time you go out, you've got all the right gear, you go out, you replace it. And in terms of the time saving overall, it's dramatic, because if you don't know and you have to come back, well, that's much worse. Particularly, if it's a site that's remote or interstate or something like that, that can be extremely taxing, trying to get everything done in the time frame you have allowed, because we never think about those things because we don't even know about them. So yeah, that definitely something that is a big factor. But literal documentation as well, though. If something gets moved or changed, or we used a different part, or the rack's laid out differently, whatever that might be, all of those things are quite hard to parse out later, because you're effectively recreating all of that work that you did in the first place. So, and I can't stress this enough, it's probably not going to be you who's going out to do it. It might be, but often it's someone else, and they have to try and figure it all out. And if that's not, you might remember that you ran that weird red cable down, the wall there, and it's just sitting in the wall cavity 2 inches from the bottom, but the next person comes out just guessing.
For over 20 years, Connected Magazine has been the leading voice of the Australian AV and custom integration industry, and it still holds that position today. Whether you work in commercial or residential, Connected Magazine and connectedmag.com.au are your go-to sources for news, product updates, and deep dives into industry trends, all from a team of experienced writers. Want to learn more? Visit the website via the link in this episode's description, or have a chat with the team at the next industry event. So you mentioned a bit earlier about the industry not necessarily being very good at keeping each other accountable. How do you see that working? So if we were to somehow try to make each other accountable when it comes to technical debt, how do you actually see that working?
Yeah, that's a great question, and I'd love to have a pithy answer. But I think really it probably sort of starts at home, for want of a better term. It's checking your own work, even if it's literally you checking your own work. Did I actually write down, if I could walk in now and check every single cable, are they all the way, that I thought, is every patch panel labeled the way it is in real life, or did something change at some point? Are my markups correct? Have we modified some lighting things and forgot to regenerate the paperwork for that? Checking those things yourself, even if it's a 5-10 minute check at the end of, before walking off site, can make a massive difference. But more importantly, if you've got a new person particularly, checking the work that they're doing to make sure they're not developing bad habits, but more importantly, to make sure that those things that they don't actually know about yet being captured. When you've been doing it for a while, you just see these things without having to really concentrate too much on them. It's kind of, they jump out. But when you're new and trying to figure it all out, they're not obvious. They might have made an obvious mistake but it's only obvious to you, not obvious to them. So the accountability is more about just making sure that we're all sort of, I guess, honest with ourselves a little bit, that we're checking our own work or checking our other people. And it could go in either direction too. You might have, the brand new guy checking your stuff. Does this all match up? Here's the documentation. I used to get the guys in our office to check work I'd done. Specifically, I would choose someone who actually didn't know anything about what I'd done. Like, I very purposely not choose a programmer, because the programmers that come and look at it and they go, oh yeah, I can see you've just done that, and that's the same as these things, so I won't bother checking that. Whereas the guys who didn't know anything, it's like, I don't know, I better check everything. So it doesn't really, it's not about whether it's been done perfectly. It's about whether what you've got on hand is accurate and that anything that's not correct is listed out to be addressed later. That's the critical part.
So I've seen a lot of market research from around the world, and one of the questions that does keep getting asked is about service contracts. I mean, do you offer it as standard? And then the other side is documentation. Do you charge for documentation? Do you produce documentation? And comparably, we are one of the worst countries in developing and offering and delivering any form of documentation, and particularly service plans. We just don't seem to do it.
Indeed.
How do integrators address the idea of technical debt if they're not doing that?
Yeah. Look, those things are a huge part of it. The service contracts in particular are a way of automatically, effectively addressing technical debt. If someone's already paid you in advance to keep things running, then the chances are it's going to be quite easy to schedule in new time to go and address those things. The hardest thing is when you've got a fixed price kind of contract, you've done the work, you've run out of time for reasons that may not be your own fault, but that there's things that aren't quite right. That is an extremely difficult thing to deal with. It's either a difficult conversation, which is still better than leaving a mess behind, or a service contract. And those things are something that we all need to try harder to develop without question. And documentation's, another factor there where we don't value it enough. It's the most important part. It's the only way we can figure out what's happened later. And sometimes that boils down to assuming you're going to be there forever, and maybe you will be, and that'd be great if you're doing a good job. I'm sure you'll be on that job forever. But if it's someone else coming in, it doesn't hurt to think about presenting what you've done in a nice light either. I want to feel proud of the work I've done and have someone come in to take over a job potentially and not feel flustered and like everything's out of control. So I think there's enormous value in having that done well and done right. And I don't have a solution for it. I wish I did. We tried a variety of different things to address that when I was an integrator. And I'm pretty proud of some of the things we did. We submitted frequently for CDR awards, for example, for documentation. And, we got one or two there, I think, over the years. But, it's definitely undervalued in general, I think. And when and look, I get that too, because you see those CDR awards and you see the level of detail that's in some of that documentation. It's like, that's pretty intimidating. I can't produce that by myself. How would that happen? But it's not really like, although the level of documentation that some of the integrators produces is spectacular, it doesn't have to be that. It can be a spreadsheet. It doesn't matter. It's more about, it's going to be functional. That's the critical part. It can look pretty as well. That'd be great. But if at least it is functional and complete, that's more important. And certainly that is the thing that's going to save you actual money. That's the thing that's really going to make a positive difference to your business, is that when you go back out there, you're armed with everything you need. Even if it's written down on a piece of paper, it's better than not having anything at all. But yeah, look, the service contract thing is something that I just kind of stunned. It's never really been a thing, because it seems like an absolute obvious choice for our industry. Things are changing all the time. We're working with clients who are often not very sophisticated. We're doing quite complicated work on fairly inscrutable equipment, and they need our help. And they know they need our help. So I feel like that's something that we should all be sort of working towards figuring out something more effective there. We should be better at that. We definitely should be better at that. And that would help this as well.
Yeah, for a very long time, I've said that documentation is really a way to legitimize what we do. Because otherwise, are you not a home hobbyist? I mean, prove it.
Yeah, right.
Show what you've done.
Yep. And it's not just that like, yeah, absolutely. But also there's a level of sophistication that belies walking into, say, a pretty rack. You walk in and there's all this nice flashing lights and it all looks great. That's wonderful. We all love that, obviously. But that's not the same as being able to pull the rack out and going, I know how to make A go to B, or replace this piece of equipment without it being a day-long sojourn. There's the documentation is far, far more valuable. It helps us quote effectively. It means we can service equipment. It means we know what we're dealing with before we get there, ideally. And again, the documentation doesn't necessarily just need to be, I've run this cable from here to here, or I've got this equipment involved. That includes things like site notes as you go, and pictures, videos. All of those things are really important and not that difficult. I mean, everyone's got a pretty effective video camera in their pocket these days. So, that's just changed everything in terms of the type of documentation we can generate. It doesn't have to be external documentation either. Like it can just be for you, but that's extremely valuable because we forget, when you're there, it's all happening and it's all in your head and it's fine. You know everything that's going on. But you go back 6 months, a year, 5 years later, or in some cases in my history it was 20 years later, and you've got to find stuff. And if you don't have anything that helps you find that, that's quite tricky. So yeah, it's worth putting the effort in up front.
And I would say that any integrator who's been around a while has had a handover job. And really, they just need to look at it as in what would have helped them fix that job. That's what they should be developing for all of their other jobs.
Indeed. Yeah.
Yeah.
And again, that's one of those sort of signposts for some sort of technical debt where you can't rely on the documentation, or worse, you don't even go looking for it because it's going to be wrong. I remember hearing a story years ago about Telstra technicians not filling in the cards anymore because they knew it was going to be wrong anyway. So they just get there and test everything. And that was the only way they could figure out what line was patched to where. That's horrifying and unnecessary but common, like we've all been there. We've all had those exact kind of jobs where we've walked in and that's sort of how it's felt. Like I've got to start from scratch. I can't rely on anything that's here. It's all wrong and I've got to start again. I don't think it really needs to be like that. And if that technical debt thing is exactly what that's supposed to address. Like I haven't done this 100% the way it should be. I'll factor in some time to deal with it. And so then that won't be a problem down the track. And if it is your site forever, then it's immensely beneficial because you're going to go in with confidence each time. They say, can you do this? Yes, I can. I can look at the documentation. I know precisely how the job's set up. I know what equipment's in there. I know how it's all connected. I know what I need to replace. I'm not just guessing going, oh, geez, I got out here and I don't have the right cable or the right power supply or whatever it might be. Yeah, that's worth its weight in gold.
And that's right. And very, very few people have eidetic memories. So you're not going to remember every job you work on unless you cut every single job you do.
I'm trying to remember them all.
So if there was an integrator who knew that they had accumulated technical debt across a project, when it comes to solving that, are there things that they should prioritize? Or I guess the other question is, how do they prioritize what they should be fixing first?
So that's obviously a tricky question because the approach to fixing that sort of stuff might just be, hey, this is an easy thing to add into another site visit, which it works really well if you happen to be going back out there. If it's something where you've got to the end of a job and there's some unresolved things and no one wants to pay for it and so forth, those can obviously be quite complicated conversations to have with end users and so forth. Do you take that on yourself? Do you, try and have a conversation with the owner to see if they can deal with it? In a lot of cases, if you can identify things as you go and you've got the documentation accurate as you go, those conversations become a lot easier because you're bringing them up well before they happen. It's a lot easier to go in and say, hey, we've already spoken 3 times about how that wall got ripped out and we had to move all those things. We haven't actually addressed that. That still needs to be addressed. Let's book in, let's chuck in a change request to make that happen. So the priority, I suppose, is to always be looking. There's not necessarily anything that you want to put first, but anything that can be dealt with, is worth dealing with. In the same way that, if you have a windfall, you might whack a bit more money on your mortgage. There's no bad time to do that, but certainly it's critical to make sure that you've actually able to address that in some way. So that's probably the bigger factor is, who deals with it, who pays for it, I guess, and when can that actually happen in a meaningful sense, because that can be a far more difficult part of fixing this particular problem. But yeah, look at it as early and as frequently as possible. If you made a change and you can fix it on the next visit, fantastic, just do it. Add in an extra 10 minutes. Even if you've got to wear it, it's probably worth it, because if you're back there in a year's time, you might save yourself half a day.
So accountability, documentation, and service plans. Obviously, we've spoken about those 3 things. Are there any other shifts in mindset that the industry needs to adopt in order to properly deal with technical debt?
Yeah, look, I think the main thing is probably just a bit of self-reflection, perhaps. It's okay. It happens. It's not like anyone's setting out to do bad work, and it's not even bad work. It's just a set of things that led to that, that spot. The other thing I think that's really important for people to think about or to help with is to turn this into more of a business process. This is not really something that the low-level tech should be worrying about. They're just going out and doing their job. They just need to follow the process. But if there's no process there to follow, then that's inevitably going to lead to these issues down the track. And worse than that, that someone in management might not necessarily be able to identify those problems. That might not be their area of expertise. So getting those processes in place to A, identify them, but B, also be able to schedule practical change and deal with them. That's really the critical part, I think. Making sure that there's a little bit of not to say there's something bad or evil or a compromise or something that is a mistake. It's just part of the process. In the same way that if you purchase a car and you get finance for that car because you get another tech on the road to earn more money for your business, that's a positive thing as long as you keep paying the car loan. If you don't pay it, then bad things tend to happen. But it's not necessarily a bad thing. It can be a conscious choice that you're doing to make sure you might want to deliver something a bit earlier than you expected because there's a strong need for that, and that's fine as long as everybody's aware that there's a consequence to that choice and that it's going to have to be dealt with at some point. So it's not a bad thing to go back to the client and say, hey, I know you want this done in this particular way or this particular time, but that means we do need to schedule something in now. So let's get that on the table now rather than pretending it's going to be fine because it's not.
So there might be some integrators listening to this and they'll understand the idea of technical debt. They've probably done it themselves. You mentioned business processes there. What should that actually look like?
Yeah. Look, in a lot of cases, it's going to be something that's easy to fit into the existing workflow. So, for example, if there's, cable schedules that are on a spreadsheet and the tech has access to that, they might be able to just literally make those changes live. If, on the other hand, it's done through some sort of software package or there's someone back in the office that might do that work, something needs to be put in place where that information can get sent back to the right people to make sure those things get updated. We used to have a guy internally who did all of our AutoCAD markups and those sorts of things. And so it was really important for us to provide enough detail that he could make an effective change to those without necessarily being able to see what we've done. We might have moved something somewhere that had to be reflected properly on the plan. Speakers were a classic example. They'd get moved for one reason or another. Maybe not that much, but enough to be a problem. You don't want to be whacking a hole in the ceiling in the wrong spot. And so, it was basic stuff. Like if this gets moved, this is what you do about it. You measure it in this way, you take a photo, you do whatever you need to do. So it's not necessarily going to be the same for everybody because it will, a one-man band is going to be very different to, we used to have 20 people. So that's obviously a very different kind of process. But the most important thing is that there's some sort of system or some sort of thought that goes into that system. I just do service order sheets. Great. Use that. You've already got it. Just make sure you write down whatever those changes are so that the next time it comes up, you've got that in front of you and you know what you've got to do when you get out there next time. If it's something that's going to be reflected to someone else, bear that in mind. We need to communicate this sort of information back. How are we going to do that to make sure they don't make a mistake because they're not here to see it? So it's something. It's more important to have something that fits in naturally to that process than it is to use any particular new type of software or whatever. There are plenty of things that can help do that, though. Of course, there's loads of different software out there that can make those processes a lot easier. Already have all those sorts of things built in, but I'm loath to mention them all because there's so many. It would be here for the next half an hour going through.
So to play devil's advocate here, say I was an integrator and, let's face it, I'm deathly allergic to manual labor, so it's not going to happen. As let's say a wise man once said, I don't hold a hose, mate. But what if I hear this and go, okay, I accrue technical debt in projects. So what? I'm not going to do anything about it. What's the worst thing that could happen?
Yeah, look, I guess that's a good question. The consequences are delayed, frankly. Probably nothing bad's going to happen in the short term. And so, there's the real issues, I guess, are reputational damage. And if you are attempting to maintain that project, there'll be literal financial implications almost certainly down the track. But I mean, if you're inclined to just do something and walk away, I guess you could do that. But the I hope anyway, most of the people listening to this are striving to do better work and they're proud of the work that they do and they want to, push the industry forward and rising tides and all that sort of thing. So in a most direct sense, if you're planning on keeping these customers, then I'd suggest doing it just because it actually does have a direct benefit. So, even if it's just purely for that motivation, that's a good enough reason, I think. But if there's, if there's things that you don't want to do for whatever reason, that doesn't necessarily, for example, if you don't want to have that hard conversation with the client at the end of it to go, well, really, you need to pay me to come back for another day, but you don't actually want to have that conversation with them, at least finish off the documentation and leave it there, so that if something does go wrong, it might help you out or the next person out to try and resolve that. It's fairly low stakes in the scheme of things. Most of these things aren't complicated things to do. They're things that we should be doing anyway. And we all know we should be doing them. And it's not like we're actively trying not to do them. And I guess that's, again, why I sort of think of it more of a process thing. Once it's built into your processes, you're not really getting to the end and saying, oh, I can't be bothered, I'm not going to do any of this sort of stuff, because you've just been doing it as you go.
So what I'm hearing, though, is that nobody's going to die.
Indeed. Yeah, look, I guess the critical thing with technical debt is it's not something that we're actively doing wrong. It's not something that makes us bad people or bad integrators or makes the job, suboptimal for any real reason. It's just a part of doing the work. It's going to happen to everyone at some stage or another. And if you address it in ideally a timely way, but even if you just address it at all, even if it is just as simple as updating the documentation, maybe you don't even use it down the track, it's something that's always going to have a positive impact and probably a literally positive financial benefit, to you, because when you go out there that next time, it's going to be easier. Next time you get a quote, you're going to not feel the pressure of having to try and remember everything, or maybe even go and have to do a site visit so that you can actually do that sort of stuff, because you've already done all that. You're on top of it. And I guess that's the key thing. It gives you confidence as well. Like you've done the job well. You're happy to talk about it. You're happy to quote on something new or book in a service call, because you've got that confidence that, yeah, we're on top of this. We've covered all our bases. We know where we're at. We don't have to worry about any surprises when we get out there, because we've already done it. And so when it becomes part of the process, that's not a hard thing to do. You're not putting in that much extra effort as you go along. You're just doing it as you go. And so I guess the key takeaway there would be, don't look at this as like some huge burden. It's like, oh, I don't know whether I'm really going to be able to do all that. It's really, there's a bit of upfront thinking about it. How should I address this to make sense for my business? But once you've got that down, once you've got those processes in place, it's really just going through the motions, and it actually makes some of those conversations easier too. If you get to the end of the job and there's some compromises, you've documented it all down as you've gone. You can go back and say, hey, look, we already spoke about this. We should be dealing with this, and this is how we're going to do it. And that they're going to walk away feeling better, even if it is a difficult conversation, because you're on top of it and you're going to come out looking better overall. So I think it's just a net positive, really, just to deal with it as it happens. It makes your job better. It'll make you feel better, give you more confidence about the work you're doing. And it's just generally, pushing everyone forward and in a better direction.
That was Richard Mullins. And if you took one thing from this conversation, let it be this. The cost of fixing a shortcut is always higher than the cost of doing it right. Every system you install tells a story, and every compromise you make leaves a footprint. Technical debt builds silently, but it will demand repayment eventually. If you want to get better at managing your risk, protecting your reputation, and building more resilient systems, start with documentation. Build habits, talk with your team, and if you want to explore this further or have thoughts to share, reach out directly. Thanks for listening to Master Integrator. I'm Paul Skelton. I'll see you next time.